So while I was a Bernie supporter back before the 2016 election, I was a hardcore Bernie fan, even went to one of his rallies. I watched one of the movies by Dinesh D'Souza, that Hillary's America. My dad had recommended it, and one of the things that struck me was that there was a black woman, a historian, who was talking about how it was the Democrats that were the racist ones. And I was kind of confused because, I was a Democrat at the time and had a big issue with this. So anyhow, I did some searching, and you can look here in my browser where it says historyhouse.gov, exhibitions and publications. Anyhow, I typed in blacks in Congress in the 1800s, and this is what I got. So I'm going to read this to you so you can actually see this. So it said the Negroes' temporary farewell, Jim Crow, and the exclusion of African Americans from Congress, 1887 and 1929. On December 5th, 1887, for the first time in almost 2 decades, Congress convened without an African American member. All the men who stood up in awkward squads to be sworn in on Monday had white faces, noted a correspondent from the Philadelphia Record who witnessed 317 members of the 50th Congress, 1887 to 1889, take the oath of office on the House floor. The Negro is not only out of Congress, he is practically out of politics. Although 3 black representatives served in the very next Congress, the total number of African Americans serving on Capitol Hill diminished significantly as the congressional focus on racial equality faded in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Only 5 African Americans were elected to the House during the next decade: Henry Cheatham, George Henry White of North Carolina, Thomas Miller and George Murray of South Carolina, and John Mercer Langston of Virginia. But despite their isolation, these men sought to represent the interests of all African Americans. Like their predecessors in the years after the Civil War, these 5 confronted violent elections, fought for their seat after having their victories contested, faced difficulty procuring desirable committee assignments, and were unable to pass their legislative initiatives. Moreover, these black members faced further impediments in the form of legalized segregation and disenfranchisement, general disinterest in progressive racial legislation, and the increasing power of conservatives in Congress, a number of whom had served in the Confederate Army, who opposed federal efforts to protect civil rights in the South. In the decade after the 1876 presidential election, the Republican-dominated state governments in the South, which had provided the basis for black political participation during Reconstruction, were undermined by former Confederates and their sympathizers who rebuilt the, what's that say? Democratic Party? Wow. Go figure. And seized control of southern state governments by brutally suppressing black voters and eliminating the power of the Republican Party below the Mason-Dixon line. The electoral crisis of 1876 revealed fissures within the GOP as many party stalwarts focused on commercial issues rather than on civil rights agenda previously pursued by the radical Republicans. This period marked the beginning of a multi-generational deterioration of the relationship between black and white Republicans. By the 1890s, most African Americans had either been barred from or abandoned electoral politics as extra-legal violence and economic reprisals became a constant threat. Advocacy for African Americans in Congress became substantially more difficult as the number of black members dwindled. After Representative George Henry White's departure from the House in 1901, no African American served in the U.S. Congress for nearly 3 decades. The length and persistence of this exile from national politics starkly conveyed the suffocating effect of the reign of Jim Crow. the brutal system of racial segregation imposed upon Southern blacks by law and custom. Beginning in the last quarter of the 19th century, African Americans, the vast majority of whom still lived in the South, experienced unique suffering and deprivation under the system of racial segregation known as Jim Crow. Enforced by legal and extra-legal means, the laws and practices that constituted the Jim Crow system evolved over several decades and ultimately restricted civil and political rights, economic opportunities, and social mobility for African Americans until the 1960s. The term derived, golly, sorry, I can't read, don't have my glasses on, from a popular character in Southern minstrel shows in which white performers in blackface portrayed African Americans. How the term Jim Crow came to be associated with segregation is not clear, but it was eventually used to describe both the formal and the informal manifestations of segregation in the South. Beginning with Tennessee in 1870, every Southern state adopted laws against interracial marriage. By the 1880s, most public places and many private businesses had whites-only and colored facilities. These included schools, seating areas, drinking fountains, and workspaces, government buildings, train stations, hospitals, restaurants, hotels, theaters, barbershops, laundries, and even public restrooms. Virtually all the political advances afforded freemen during the Reconstruction were rolled back and eradicated during the years after 1890. Why is that? Seriously. I mean, how does that happen? In the South, the races were separated even more systematically and rigidly than during slavery. Really? Interesting. Many blacks were reduced to a second-class citizenship than the white ruling class repeatedly explored for political and economic purpose. As C. Van Woodward wrote in 1955, in one of the first scholarly reinterpretations of this period, Jim Crow laws did not assign the subordinate group a fixed status in society. They were constantly pushing the Negro farther down. These are the footnotes, just so you don't think I'm trying to make this crap up. So I click the next button and I'm on to the next page. You can still see it's historyhouse.gov. Pre-congressional experience. Though they served in Congress during the onset of Jim Crow laws, the 5 black Americans elected in the late 19th century had earlier benefited from the federal government's intervention in Southern society during the Reconstruction era. The large federal presence in the former slave states included investments in the region's educational and economic opportunities. All 5 men were born in the South and hailed from the former Confederacy. 3 had been born into slavery, freed by the time they were teenagers at the conclusion of the Civil War in 1865. Like their predecessors, most of them elected in the early Jim Crow era. 4 of the 5 were of mixed race parents, 2 of whom were their master's sons. Unlike their predecessors, however, these late 19th century members received substantially more formal education than the first generation of members immediately after the Civil War. Though their primary and secondary schooling was sporadic, all 5 attended college, compared with 2 of the 17 black men who served before them. 3 practiced law: John Langston, Thomas Miller, and George White. Miller receiving training at Howard University, but in most rural states, formal legal training was not a requirement for passing the bar, which often consisted of an oral exam administered by the local judges and lawyers. Several law schools rejected Langston in the 1850s. Tutored by local professionals, he passed an oral exam in 1854 for admission to the Ohio bar. George White studied law with retired judge and former Confederate officer William John Clark in the late 1870s and later served as a district solicitor in his home of New Bern, North Carolina. Black representatives in the Jim Crow era also had substantial political resumes before arriving in Congress. John Langston was perhaps the most impressive. He became one of the first African Americans in history to hold elective office when the Brownhelm Township in Ohio elected him clerk in 1855, and he later served as a U.S. diplomat in Haiti and Santo Domingo. As political opportunities diminished after Union troops withdrew from the South in 1877, African Americans depended on local connections to secure government jobs doled out by the elected officials. George Murray, for example, obtained a patronage position as a customs inspector in Charleston Harbor from 1890 to 1893. See how it says next section right here? That's what I used when I flipped the page. Here are some footnotes just so you can see some of the stuff is from like 1849. Talk about historians, so just so you can see this stuff here. Shifting Republican focus. Black members of Congress remained loyal Republicans. Wait, Republicans? Black people? Republicans? Jeez. I thought all Republicans were racist. At least that's what I'm told when I have, like a Trump sticker on my car by people who are Democrats. Interesting. That's very interesting. So black members of Congress remained loyal Republicans, but their allies at home in Congress were quickly disappearing. As Democrats reasserted their power, Southern politics in the post-Reconstruction years witnessed the rapid collapse of radical Republican state governments, which had drawn from the ranks of newly freed African American men. Over just a short time, a cadre of local, state, and national politicians composed of many former Confederates and Democrats undermined the Republican regimes and ended the regional experiment in multiracial democracy. In the redeemed South, the Democratic Party eventually became synonymous with the codification and formalization of racial segregation. See that? Democratic Party. Just so you know. These are things you don't learn in history, nor do they teach you on that plasma box that you have hooked up to cable in your house. Though the Republican Party's ideological makeup remained complicated in the late 1880s, two primary factions emerged, the Reformers and the Moneymen. Reformers clung to the idealistic plans of post-war radical Republicans to extend full civil rights to African Americans. Wait a second. Republicans trying to get African Americans rights? That's not what we're told. We're told that Republicans are against black people, or African Americans, however you choose to call them. Anyhow, that's just like not what we're being told or fed, spoon-fed by the people on the big black box that's made of plasma or has a big tube in it and is considered programming. Anyhow, so let's go back to that. Though the Republican Party's ideological makeup remained complicated in the late 1880s, two primary factions emerged, the Reformers and the Moneymen. Reformers clung to the idealistic plans of post-war radical Republicans to extend full civil rights to African Americans. Yet they began to lose support in the face of popular demands to lay the unfulfilled egalitarian promises of Reconstruction America to rest. A growing interest in American commercial power, the stance of the Moneymen led Congress to deprioritize civil rights legislation. Thanks, Congress. Jeez. In the 1880s and early 1890s, control of the House chamber seesawed between Democrats unsympathetic to the concerns of African Americans, and Republicans increasingly ambivalent to those same concerns. Though one reformer implored Republican colleagues to never surrender the great principles of human liberty of which the party was born the champion, Republican leaders sensed little electoral opportunity in pushing for black voting rights in the South. Here's that P word I want to call him, because I'm sorry, if you have a cause, you need to stand up for it regardless. One historian explains that the Republicans harbored some hope that if race was no longer salient in Southern politics, other issues might rise to the surface and become the catalyst for a realignment of the parties. If the Republican Party in the South was no longer identified with and supported by black voters, it might have the opportunity to redefine itself and become accepted as a legitimate political entity by white Southerners. What? Let me read that again. If the Republican Party in the South was no longer identified with and supported by black voters, it might have the opportunity to redefine itself and become accepted as a legitimate political entity by white Southerners. Black representatives admonished their party for abandoning the freedmen, a veritable set of fools a few of our party leaders have been, Thomas Miller said on the House floor in February 1891. They will listen to all the cheap sentimentality sounded under the name of Negro domination and business prostration. Be swerved from a plighted duty to a faithful constituency the country over. Rapid industrialization brought major changes to America's economy and consequently to American society. Race reforms, however, just as quickly disappeared from the political agenda and out of the public eye. Between 1869 and 1899, the population of the United States nearly tripled. Railroads extending to the Pacific Ocean allowed goods to travel around the country cheaply. The invention of the telephone in 1876 improved communication. Entrepreneurs such as steel magnate Andrew Carnegie amassed fortunes in manufacturing. In 1890, for the first time in American history, industrial workers outnumbered farmers. Immigration from southern Europe had begun to increase, just as the American frontier was declared closed. Taking stock of the previous century of American development, the journalist and historian Frederick Jackson Turner argued that the nation had entered a new, uncertain era. Movement has been America's dominant fact, he told an audience at the American Historical Association gathered for the 1893 World Columbian Exhibition in Chicago. But never again will such gifts of free land offer themselves. The frontier is gone, and with its going has closed the first period of American history. Such tectonic social shifts, that's a tongue twister, created cultural uncertainty. Historian Robert Weeb describes the late 19th century America as a distended society. Industrialization and expansion swept away the familiar rhythms and guideposts of local community life, leaving a society without a core and widespread dislocation and bewilderment. Even long familiar political landmarks were in flux. According to historian Robert Marcus, the issues of race and sectionalism during the Civil War and Reconstruction stabilized political loyalties by keeping eyes focused on a past full of familiar friends and enemies, and fulfilled some of the need for order. But by the 1880s and 1890s, politicians could only guess at the direction in which the electorate was moving and wonder if the party system they knew was capable of containing the new populations, new pressures, and new demands that all parts of an increasingly interconnected society made on the political system. The Republican Party recast itself, the party of commerce, and hesitated at waving the bloody shirt, the tactic that radicals used during Reconstruction to stir up resentment against the South by recalling the sacrifices of Union troops. Instead, as the memories of the war and Reconstruction faded by the mid-1890s, GOP politicians found unprecedented success with their new economic message. There's some footnotes down there. Let's see what the next section has to say. You can still see them on that historyhouse.gov. In the decades after Reconstruction, black constituencies in the South disappeared faster than the Western frontier, and by the turn of the century, Southern white Democrats had effectively shut African Americans and opposition parties out of the political process using a toxic mix of varying legal mechanisms and extralegal violence. Wait, Democrats? Get out. Here I'm told that it's the Republicans. Jeez. You guys are being hoodwinked, people, if you still believe that crap, dude. I'm telling you. But hey, you're free to believe what you want. I'm just reading the facts. Anyhow, so let's pick up where extralegal violence. They rewrote state constitutions to codify segregation and implemented a maze of local and statewide electoral devices between 1889 and 1908, including the poll tax, the grandfather clause, and literacy tests. Poll taxes, which were widely adopted and hugely successful at excluding black voters. Wait a second. Who did this? Oh, wait. It was the Democrats. Jeez. Go figure. Okay. So, let's see. Excluding black voters required prospective voters to pay as much as $2, a considerable sum at the time. So-called grandfather clauses based on an individual's family voting history were legal mechanisms enshrined in Southern state laws, which were designed to disenfranchise African Americans while simultaneously preserving the right to vote for white Southerners. Who did that again, people? Jeez. Wow. Anywho, while each varied by state, grandfather clauses were effective in limiting black voting rights by linking an individual's right to vote to the voting rights or registration status of their descendants. Wow. Finally, literacy tests went beyond evaluating whether or not a potential voter could read. They also asked a range of questions related to arcane knowledge of state and federal laws, among other subjects. Additional laws required documents many voters did not possess, and to further restrict access, voter registration was sporadic and often occurred at inconvenient times. Strategies that worked in one state were copied in others. Each state became, in effect, a laboratory for testing one device or another, wrote a historian of the era. Indeed, the cross-fertilization and coordination between the movements to restrict the suffrage in the southern states amounted to a public... I'm going to just... C word right there. See that. Okay? Because I don't want to get flagged. One of the last but most effective devices was the Democratic white primary. Really? See that? Right there. Okay, people. In which black voters and black candidates were not allowed to participate by excluding African Americans from the process, during which the parties selected candidates and set their strategies. The Democratic Party became the de facto government in the South. South Carolina representatives Thomas Miller and George Murray, for example, consistently protested the 8-box law. In 1882, state law requiring multiple ballot boxes. Voters placed their ballots in boxes designated for specific offices. White voters received instructions for navigating the system, whereas black voters received no instruction, and their votes were disqualified if they dropped their ballots in the wrong box. The effect of the law was dramatic. Turnout in southeastern South Carolina on Election Day in 1880 had been close to 20%, but after the 8-box law went into effect in 1882, turnout fell to less than 10% in the decade after. I declare to you and the people of America, George Murray said on the House floor in 1883, that no gambler, no conjurer has ever planned more meaner tricks and schemes to beat his competitor or victimize his companion than has been used by the sworn officers of the law to deceive American citizens and destroy the effectiveness of their votes on Election Day. When Murray lost his South Carolina seat encompassing the Sea Islands in Charleston in 1884, only 4% of the district's eligible population had voted. State constitutional conventions called to rewrite a state's charter with the intention of eviscerating the remaining eligible black vote proved to be the final disenfranchising blow in most southern states. To call such a convention required majorities in both houses of the state legislature. Voters had to approve the proposed convention and then select delegates to act as their representatives. The ratification process typically took several years, but more of these conventions occurred in the 11 former Confederate states in the late 19th century than in any other period in U.S. history. The first wave of conventions, which took place just after the Civil War, involved a requirement to rejoin the Union. Under Reconstruction law, former Confederate states were required to redraft their constitutions to incorporate elements of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which outlawed slavery and guaranteed the right to vote. A second wave of constitutional conventions occurred in the 1870s and restored the political rights of former Confederates. The third wave, between 1890 and 1910, rolled back. This ain't Walmart, people. This is taking the